For the U.S. Asiatic Fleet, the first few months of 1942 were bleak. With its largely antiquated surface ships and far lesser size than the Pacific Force, the force was completely unprepared to defeat the Imperial Japanese Navy in a major engagement. However, because Admiral Thomas C. Hart's Asiatic Fleet was headquartered in the Philippines, it was right in the way of Japan's southward push. Days after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers destroyed the Cavite Navy Yard near Manila. Additionally, a large portion of America's land-based air power that was supposed to assist the naval troops had been destroyed. The majority of Hart's surface units managed to flee south to the Netherlands East Indies after the main operations base was destroyed and the Philippine defenses collapsed in the face of a Japanese assault. Unfortunately, Dutch seas were not going to be any better for the ships. The desperate Allies made the decision to pool their naval forces in Southeast Asia in February. After forming a quickly organized fleet of American, British, Dutch, and Australian ABDA vessels, they were decisively destroyed in 3 battles: the Java Sea, February 27th, the Badaling Strait, February 19th or 20th, and the Flores Sea, February 4th. By March, Singapore, the sizable British base in Malaya, was governed by Japan. American land forces were pushed back into a tiny pocket in the Philippines, and the majority of the Allied surface forces had been driven out. The Netherlands East Indies was now being overrun by imperial armies. The early Pacific War submarines. American submarines were the Asiatic Fleet's only powerful offensive weapon during the early, challenging months of the Pacific War. The fleet, which had 29 boats at the start of the war, was a combination of newer fleet submarines and smaller antiquated ships. After training in wartime conditions for weeks before the onset of hostilities, the underwater craft were as combat-ready as they could be. The submarines were compelled to function from inadequate facilities after the Philippines was lost. There were few supplies and spare parts, much of which had been destroyed in the Cavite invasion. A number of submarine tenders served as a moving base that moved between different areas, occasionally maintaining a slight advantage over the Japanese. Many of the U.S. submarines were spotted cruising the waters surrounding the Philippines in December 1941. The submarine force in the Pacific was primarily stationed to thwart Japanese invasion fleets. After that, the troops moved south and finally camped in Australia. The boats carried out various actions in early 1942. While some were called in for special operations to the American garrison island of Corregidor near Manila Bay, more were positioned to defend the Netherlands East Indies. Asiatic submarines suffered losses and sank some enemy ships during these early operations. The S-36 ran aground and was scuttled during the first 4 months of the conflict, while the Sea Leon, Shark, and Perch were destroyed by enemy action. 10 Japanese ships were sunk by the submarines during that same period. The Seawolf. From the beginning of the Pacific War, Lieutenant Commander Fred Warder and his submarine, Seawolf, SS-197, were in the heart of things. Warder had been with the vessel when he put her into service at the Navy Yard in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on December 1st, 1939. Seawolf, the final of the 4 Sargo-class ships to be finished, displaced 2,350 tons. Warder's boat, which was 311 feet long and could reach 20 knots on the surface and just under 9 underneath, was manned by about 55 officers and enlisted men. She had 24 torpedoes on board, 4 of which were pointing forward and another equal number at the stern. The ship reported to San Diego to join the Pacific Fleet, following a workup in the Atlantic and Caribbean. Seawolf was in dock when the war began, after being deployed to the Asiatic Fleet in the fall of 1940 and sailing west to Manila. On December 8th, Warder quickly left the harbor before Japanese aircraft covered Cavite 2 days later. Despite a bold attack on a Japanese ship at Apari Harbor on the northern coast of Luzon, Warder's first war patrol led his boat into the waters off the northeast coast of the Philippines. But after 18 days at sea, he returned empty. Then, on December 31st, Warder departed the Philippines for Australia. During the journey, which was regarded as the submarine's second war patrol, no enemy ships were spotted. The third war patrol for Seawolf was a unique undertaking. On January 16th, she departed Darwin with ammo for .50 caliber machine guns headed for Corregidor. She encountered a Japanese convoy en route, but due to bad weather, she was unable to secure a decent firing position. On January 27th, she reached the beleaguered island and immediately unloaded her cargo. She embarked on the voyage with 25 passengers, 16 torpedoes, and a variety of submarine spare components. Warder set out for Surabaya, Java, rather than returning to Australia. The Java Sea Battle. On February 15th, in the middle of the afternoon, Seawolf was once more in motion. Out of Surabaya, the submarine moved slowly on the surface, accompanied by a patrol boat that helped her navigate around minefields in the area. By 5 p.m., the submarine was on her fourth war patrol, moving alone toward the north at 17 knots. The majority of the journey took place in the waters off Java, where the American submarine fleet was once more called upon to attempt to halt the Japanese invasion troops as they approached. Directly east of Java, close to the island of Bali, Seawolf met encounters with Japanese ships on February 19th. Warder launched torpedoes at 2 transports after maneuvering his craft to attack. Despite his lack of hits, he was brutally charged from the depths for his efforts. On February 25th, Seawolf again discovered Japanese ships in the Badung Strait close to Bali. Her captain launched torpedoes at a destroyer and a transport. The sonar operator reported 2 explosions on the destroyer, and he saw 1 torpedo hit the transport squarely. Warder thought he had sunk 1 or both enemy ships, so he arranged for a depth charge. However, no Japanese ships were sunk during this combat, according to post-war records. Despite his talent and perseverance, Fred Warder has yet to see any fruit from his labors. The Battle of Java. Sea fought in the final days of February saw the defeat of Allied surface ships after the American submarine forces' attempt to stop the Japanese invasion of Java failed. Almost soon, the Japanese started to land troops on the island. Seawolf and Pike, SS-173, were ordered to patrol south of Java in search of Japanese carriers believed to be operating in the region, while 12 American submarines stayed in the vicinity to cause as much damage as possible to Japanese ships. The enemy flat tops were not located by any submarine. The Christmas Island invasion is coming. As their lengthy patrol came to a close in late March, Warder and Seawolf did so just in time, as the crew was starting to feel the effects of the grueling journey. For a large portion of the patrol, several of the sailors had not seen topside. Temperaments were stretched and nerves were strained. Some of the men turned to smoking coffee grinds wrapped in toilet paper as their cigarette supplies ran low. Warder was to meet the adversary one last time. Japanese Imperial General Headquarters ordered the capture of Christmas Island on March 14, 1942. The little landmass in the Indian Ocean, located over 200 miles just south of Java's west end, was ruled by the British. Phosphates, a crucial component of the Japanese war engine, were abundant on the island. A small group of Japanese ships sailed for Christmas Island from Bantam Bay, Java, in the final days of March. 8 destroyers, 2 transports, an oiler, and 3 light cruisers made up the fleet. The occupation force's 850 troops set off on the latter. The operation was led by Rear Admiral Shoji Nishimura, who was flying his flag aboard the light cruiser Naka. While Seawolf was patrolling near Sunda Strait off the west end of Java, another American submarine radioed a contact report after picking up the Japanese invasion fleet. On March 27th, late in the afternoon, Warder got a coded communication telling him to head to Christmas Island and then get back to port in Australia. Operating on diesel power and surfaced for a nocturnal battery recharge, Warder accelerated to 14 knots and started southward. Before diving and running at periscope depth for the remainder of the day, the submarine remained on the surface for speed until shortly after 6 a.m. Plotting potential paths that the Japanese may take to close on the island, Warder studied his navigation charts of the region during the trip. Early in the evening, Seawolves surfaced again. After sailing 190 miles that day, lookouts discovered Christmas Island 25 miles off the starboard bow at precisely midnight. Admiral Nishimura's ships and Fred Warder's submarine were headed for collision. A cautious Seawolf made its approach to Christmas Island in the first hour of March 29th. Warder later noted in his log that he had begun steering various courses to Round Island to starboard at 8 miles. The skipper wanted to carefully survey the island to see if it was still in friendly hands and to seek for potential Japanese landing places. But the sky was overcast, but the moon was giving him superb visibility. An environment rich in targets. Seawolf dove to periscope depth, close to the island's northwest point at 6:18 a.m. Flying Fish Cove, a little cove on the island's north side, was the next location to be reconnoitered. This is where Warder saw what looked to be a partially sunk ship. Through the periscope, he could see the ship's yellow smokestack and gray hull. He calculated that the ship weighed 8,000 tons. Warder nosed the submarine toward the cove's entrance, finally bringing it within 3 miles. Warder observed, "No other shipping in cove. No activity on dock or in settlement." Seawolf withdrew and traveled to the island's southern region. On March 30th, about 2:15 p.m., a big seaplane was seen circling the island's northern region at a height of roughly 1,500 feet. It was unknown if it was a friend or an enemy. Apparently, the plane missed the submerged submarine. Warder raised his submarine to the surface just before 8 p.m., after spending the day underwater and thoroughly inspecting the island. The Japanese were nowhere to be seen. He came to the conclusion, "I have now determined that Flying Fish Cove is only a practical place for landing attempt." The skipper chose to patrol along an 11-mile line that was 6.5 miles from the cove's entrance because other possibilities are impracticable due to deep water close to shore, cliffs and rocks, wooded banks, heavy swells, and small landing areas. The lookouts had favorable conditions because the night was largely well lit by the moon, notwithstanding the occasional light rainstorm passing through the area. Warder believed that it was in a prime location to stop any Japanese ships that might be heading toward the island. His suspicion will shortly be validated. Seawolf, still on the surface following her evening battery charge, came to a gradual stop just after 6 a.m. on March 31st. The sonar man was listening carefully when he heard enemy ships pinging off the port side. A searchlight abruptly emerged off the starboard beam, just as Warder had given the command for Seawolf to submerge. A single Japanese warship was 3,000 yards away from the submarine, and the sonar man soon reported pinging in all directions, followed by the sound of a ship's screws approaching quickly. 2 depth charges detonated as the submarine plunged after Warder ordered the ship to descend to 200 feet and began evasive maneuvers. A determined string of 10 depth charges detonated with a loud roar a few minutes later. Fortunately, the underwater assault lasted just approximately 30 minutes. The following day, Warder ordered periscope depth just before 7 a.m., so he could have a look. He discovered a target-rich environment in the sea, which was crowded with Japanese ships. Warder scanned the area and discovered a light cruiser 7,000 yards in the same direction, 2 transports 8,000 yards off the port side, and a destroyer 6,000 yards distant. A little further to starboard was another light cruiser. A young ensign worked feverishly to record all the contact details as quickly as Warder shouted out the bearing of each sighting. Over the course of the morning, Warder eventually spotted the 2 transports, 4 destroyers, and all 3 of the Japanese light cruisers. Warder identified 2 of the light cruisers as being of the Natty type and 1 as appearing to be of the Jinsu class based on the silhouettes in his identification book. The Japanese invasion was unquestionably well underway. The ideal setting for an attack. Warder made the decision to go straight for the portside cruiser. He remembered, except for the APS transports, which are going to the cove and are too far west of me to get at them. These birds are just milling around. He veered off route a little later, in the hopes of catching one of the shipments. He made a snap decision, saying, "It doesn't look like we can get 'em." The cruisers, which appeared to be patrolling off the cove's entrance, came back into focus. As Warder examined the opposing ships closely, he saw that all of their seaplane catapults were empty. The seaplanes were presumably off, assisting with the landing. He pointed out that the Jinsu-class cruiser had a large clipper bow, with a figurehead of a burning sun or chrysanthemum. The ship looked to be the flagship, judging by the volume of communications flashing to other ships. Warder's identification and presumptions were accurate. Admiral Nishimura's flagship, Naka, was really the Jinsu-class cruiser. Warder made the decision to approach the cove's entrance more closely after Seawolf turned away when he accelerated to close on the cruiser. It appeared that the Japanese were unable to locate the submarine because all 4 ships, 2 destroyers and 2 light cruisers, were pinging simultaneously. Regarding the perfect circumstances for concealing his periscope, Warder noted, "The water's surface is nicely rumpled, with occasional white caps. 2 distant explosions were reported, and 2 seaplanes were seen flying over the cove in the minutes before 8 a.m. To go closer to the cove, Warder briefly sank to 120 feet before rising to periscope depth once more. Seawolves tracked the Naka in silence over the next hour, shifting positions multiple times while the ship turned away from the submarine. The attack of the Seawolf. It was now time for the Seawolf to launch its attack, just before 9 a.m. Warder took one more look through the periscope as the submarine slowed to 2.5 knots. He reported that the target was traveling at 15 knots and was 1,400 yards away. Warder ordered the outer torpedo doors to open, since it appeared like the Naka was slowly turning toward him. Henry Bringelman, who was in charge of the firing controls, added that everything was prepared on his end. 4 torpedoes departed Seawolf's forward tubes at precisely 8:48 a.m. during a 1-minute firing sequence. The cruiser's bow, stern, foremast, and mainmast were the targets of the fish, which were set to run at a depth of 10 feet. Warder glanced once more before delving deeply. He subsequently wrote, "I can see smoke from torpedo tracks drifting across field of vision." Seawolf increased to full speed, made a fast right turn, and started to drop down to 120 feet after observing soldiers running and shouting on the cruiser quarterdeck and measuring the distance at 700 yards. The submariners' only options were to wait for the outcome of their strike and prepare for the enemy's reaction. Regarding the delay, Warder remarked, "It felt like a year to me." An explosion was immediately audible to the commanding commander. Many people maintain that there were 2 explosions. I heard just one. The cruiser's propeller sounds appeared to cease. The crew of Seawolf thought they had an excellent target. Nevertheless, there is no evidence from post-war investigation that any Japanese ships were sunk or damaged in the region on that specific day. It's possible that the torpedoes burst too soon or malfunctioned. We're going to have a great time. After a few minutes of diving, Warder had to lower the boat to 200 feet after 8 close explosions that were believed to be depth charges. The hatch above him was closed and securely sealed as he climbed down the ladder from the conning tower into the control room. However, there were some issues with the dive. He noted that he was unable to open the flood valve due to sea pressure. Crewmen managed to open the valve by switching to hand power, but they burst a gasket in the process. It did not portend a determined Japanese onslaught, which was inevitable. Warder said, "We're going to have one hell of a time." From the starboard beam, the sound of a fast-moving ship approaching the submarine was heard. The sonar operator detected several small, far-off explosions almost simultaneously. After that, 5 more depth charges left in the distance. 7 more burst significantly closer off the stern a minute later. The range was being obtained by the enemy. It was a game of cat and mouse for the next 7.5 hours. Warder bemoaned the sub's incapacity to conceal itself, saying, "They come in on us every time a pump runs. We pump until someone gets us started, at which point we stop. The high discharge pressure and air binding make the trim pump a terrible noise." Seawolf trembled and shuddered with every explosion, shooting paint chips and cork into the stagnant inside air. Every now and again, the lights went out. As the depth charges approached from the starboard side, Chief Radio Man Joseph Eckberg listened from the radio shack. It was unthinkable, he believed, that one would not be hit directly. 25 depth charges resulted from the intense beating. The submarine made it through, but Seawolf began to suffer from the depth charging. An engine lube oil cooler that failed was one of the initial issues. Due to leaky overboard circulating water valves, salt water is gradually filling the engine sumps, Warder stated. The conning tower's cable tubes and one of the stern torpedo tubes were starting to leak, and the crew was working hard to prevent the damage from generating more issues. 2 gyro repeaters went out. Radio transmitter went haywire. Value wheels flew around the engine rooms. To prevent damage to electrical machinery, everyone carried bilge water to sanitary tanks, Warder recounted. Slowly, the submarine veered away from the ships above and toward the northwest. Recovery. In the middle of the afternoon, Seawolf seemed to have managed to elude her Japanese pursuers, but Warder remained extremely wary. For a brief glance, he alternated between staying deep and ascending to periscope depth. There were no Japanese ships nearby, according to a survey conducted just after 3 p.m. A cloud of smoke appeared to be hovering over Flying Fish Cove, and rain was seen building to the west of Christmas Island. Seawolf surfaced at 7:49 p.m. to start charging her battery for the night. The deck shelter light was glowing when the crew got topside. It was soon unplugged and will stay disconnected for the rest of the journey. It was also discovered that the ship's bell was damaged, possibly as a result of the depth charging. Uncertain whether the Japanese were still present, Warder sent a contact report before directing the ship to pass north of the island by turning east. In order to approach it in the moon's shadow and dive just below Northeast Point at around 6 a.m. for a look around in the cove, he stated, decided to obtain a position 10 miles east of Christmas by 5 a.m. When a lookout saw 2 torpedo tracks approaching the starboard side later that night, Seawolf made a crash dive. However, there were likely no real torpedoes because the sonar operator could not detect any accompanying noises. In this broad location, Warder stated, I had seen similar phenomena scan the night before. Distinct streaks of refuse material probably washed off. The island by the spring tide, and drifting to the northwest in the prevailing current. A little before midnight, Seawolf got a radio message from headquarters congratulating him on a job well done. It was really helpful, Warder remembered. He personally attached a handwritten note thanking the crew for their dedication and hard work, and he expressed his hope to join them on the next patrol. We were feeling pretty well beaten down, so we put it on the bulletin board, he said. When the officer of the deck reported that a ship had been spotted approximately 10 miles off the island's northern coast, the skipper had just fallen asleep. The officer on deck determined that the ship was an Asasio-type destroyer after closely examining it using a powerful telescope. Seawolf drifted to a stop as lookouts closely monitored the enemy ship, which ultimately turned away. Warder changed his original strategy after seeing a light cruiser later. He would now strike the Japanese ships in the afternoon after moving 20 miles east of the island. The Seawolf attacks again. But the submarine's supply of torpedoes was getting low. There was just 1 torpedo left in the tube, but it had already been removed for safety reasons due to an air leak that was 500 pounds per day. Hopefully, Warder wrote, we have 5 torpedoes left aft, which are in good shape, we think. He would have to make the most of his final shots because there were several targets nearby. When Seawolf spotted the outline of a light cruiser at 3:35 a.m., the afternoon attack plan was shelved. Warder noted in the log, ship sighted is slowly circling. It seemed that the Japanese cruiser was not aware that the submarine had surfaced. The ship made a gradual turn and headed straight at Seawolf around 30 minutes after the first sighting. The ship was closing at around 11 knots, although the range was approximately 6,000 yards at the time of sighting. In order to get a stern shot, Warder maneuvered his boat to periscope depth. He determined that the target was either the Notorious Niagara or a Notori-class light cruiser. Warder was certain that he had a decent firing setup after more than 30 minutes of maneuvering. A spread of 3 torpedoes left Seawolf's stern tubes when the distance to the target ship was reduced to roughly 1,700 yards. The 3 underwater missiles, which were aimed for the unwary cruiser, sped toward it at a depth of 10 feet. Within a minute, the sub was rocked by a fantastic explosion. Warder remained at the periscope, straining to see his attack's consequences in the dark. Observation is getting harder, and the moon is obscured, he said. Neither did I see flames, nor did I see him use his searchlight. But he could see what seemed to be thick black smoke. Seawolf, in Warder's opinion, was making the Japanese invasion of Christmas Island an expensive endeavor. Her screws were believed to have stopped, and the light cruiser appeared to be slowing down. Sonar detected high-speed screws at the same moment the vessel vanished from view. Before long, a second light cruiser was visible. Warder came to the conclusion that this is other Notori, which has come out from Northeast Point. Her speed was judged by the sonar man to be 30 knots. A troublesome angle setter prevented the remaining torpedo aft from being prepared for firing, therefore only one torpedo was put in the stern tubes. Warder made the decision not to assault since the target was zigzagging quickly and he couldn't fire a spread. At a distance, 4 depth charges exploded, and he ordered the boat down to 150 feet. 3 ships pinging and numerous screws were reported by the sound guy, but none were near. The deep dive was short-lived, as Warder managed to bring Seawolf back down to periscope depth and briefly saw the light cruiser vanishing over the horizon. There were no other ships in sight. As dawn broke, the crew disembarked from their battle stations. Lieutenant Commander Warder thought he had sunk or seriously damaged a light cruiser again after the Seawolf's crew launched a bold attack against an enemy warship for the second time in 2 days. However, post-war analysis once more failed to document any Japanese ships being sunk or damaged at that time or location. Attacking the Naka. The majority of April 1st was spent by Seawolves stalking different targets. Warder monitored the 4 destroyers and 2 light cruisers that sporadically came into view during the day, even taking note of the arrivals and departures of the cruisers' float planes. But for the majority of the day, he was unable to secure a good offensive position. He remembered, they would move somewhere else as we would close one of them for attack. It was extremely frustrating. The enemy continued to operate out of Flying Fish Cove. The landings had seemingly been successful, and by late afternoon, it appeared like the Japanese were preparing to evacuate the area. Many of the Japanese warships were sweeping the area, and the 2 transports were preparing to depart by building up steam in the harbor. Warder was certain that he was hitting a different light cruiser than the one he had struck the day before, so he chose to concentrate on Nishimura's flagship, the Naka. He took out and reviewed the 1939 edition of Jane's Fighting Ships to help him with his investigation. It pointed out that not all cruisers of the Jinsu class had clipper bows. I felt that the bow was very different when the periscope was raised for firing observation, Warder wrote. The figurehead that yesterday's Jinsu sported was not something I ever noticed or commented on during approach. Every observation I made the day before was sidetracked by this figurehead. The skipper of Seawolf recognized it was time for an attack when 4 destroyers formed a rectangle formation around the light cruiser. Before the transports left, all 4 destroyers were pinging in an attempt to find any enemy submarines in the area. Turning, Seawolf brought her stern tubes to bear. Simultaneously, the Naka made a sudden turn in the direction of the submarine. Regarding the shooting arrangement, Warder stated, "This is where he made his mistake. The final 2 aft torpedoes departed Seawolf's stern tubes at 5:02 p.m. Warder was not taking any chances, especially with 4 destroyers in the area. In order to make a getaway and reach a depth of 200 feet, he promptly ordered a turn to starboard. As the submarine began to descend, there was a loud explosion that sounded like one of the torpedoes had struck its target. In conclusion, Warder said, "Sound did not hear this fellow's propellers again, and I feel sure we got him. I don't think these light cruisers can take much, based on how quickly Natalia sank this morning." At last, Seawolf's efforts had paid off. The light cruiser made a rapid turn, but it was too late when a spotter in a nearby Japanese destroyer noticed a torpedo track rushing toward the Naka. The flagship's starboard side was struck by a single torpedo. The Japanese pursued. The attack would not be taken lightly by the Japanese. As the submarine attempted a stealthy departure to the west, some secondary explosions were heard, most likely from the torpedo hits. The Seawolf soldiers were in for a long night. Later, Warder wrote about the night. "They gave us hell until near midnight." At a safe distance, the depth charging began with 3 explosions that coincided with the sound of the torpedoes striking the Naka. Crewmen waited for the worst while confined together in the Seawolf's 7 compartments. The air smelled bad and stale. The heat and humidity were nearly intolerable when the air conditioner was switched off to cut down on noise. Sweat flowed from both crew and equipment. The only thing many sailors could do was lie down on their bunks and wait. The sickening smell was just growing stronger. People appeared to be moving slowly. Saline tablets were distributed by Chief Pharmacist, Mate Frank Loaiza, but they didn't appear to be helpful. The suffering finally came to an end. Warder thought he had given the Japanese the slip and ordered periscope depth at 7 p.m. because the last depth charge had dropped an hour earlier. But during the climb, a terrible incident happened. Due to an improperly adjusted forward trim tank, the submarine began to rocket up to the surface instead of rising gently. Seawolf was broaching when the top of the submarine's conning tower cracked the surface, producing a visible water spray. The boat started to descend when Warder promptly ordered an emergency dive, but not before drawing the enemy's attention. The sub appeared to be directly on top of the Japanese. At 7:33 p.m., the first of several depth charges exploded. The blasts were too near to be comfortable. The majority of the 18 depth charges that remained were useless as Seawolf quickly descended to 200 feet. However, the submarine had to quickly escape her pursuers as the battery power began to run dangerously low. Early in the evening, we turned off everything but the gyro and an IC motor generator, Warder recalled. The crew may never see daylight again if the submarine is unable to reach the surface for charging in the near future. What walking was done quietly, talking was only in whispers. With only one destroyer remaining to hold the submarine down, it sounded as though the majority of the Japanese fleet had left the region. Even though we couldn't hear him with our sound equipment, a sleeper remained directly above us and listened to us. He occasionally dropped 1 to 4 depth charges from a Y cannon while displaying almost no speed. Seawolf moved slowly as she stole away from her stalker. We can only thank God that we were able to escape because there was not enough power left for any further use of speed. It had nothing to do with my good management, Warder admitted. When Seawolf proceeded to periscope depth shortly after 10 p.m., the sound of a ship pinging somewhere off the starboard quarter was still audible. However, a scan of the region revealed no ships. With his crew nearly exhausted and no working torpedoes, Lieutenant Commander Warder headed for Fremantle, Australia. Seawolf surfaced at midnight and sped westward, stopping along the route to replenish its much-needed batteries. The Christmas Island defeat. The Christmas Island battle was over. Due to the quick surrender of the small garrison, which was primarily composed of Indian soldiers, the Japanese attack was unchallenged on land. On April 4, 1942, a U.S. Navy communique said that an American submarine had sunk a Japanese light cruiser close to the island and was probably responsible for sinking another. Despite only being struck by one torpedo, the flagship Naka suffered significant damage. After the Navy hauled her back to Java, she traveled independently to Singapore for short-term repairs. After returning to Japan for long-term repairs, the light cruiser returned to the combat zone in 1943, but on February 18, 1944, American carrier-based planes sank it close to Truk. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Admiral Nishimura would perish despite having escaped Seawolf's attack on Naka. It was not for lack of bold leadership or diligence that Fred Warder and his men failed to achieve a greater score off Christmas Island. Before being assigned to lead the United States, Warder completed 7 war patrols with the Seawolf, possibly as a result of defective torpedoes, a persistent issue in the early years of the conflict. New London, Connecticut is home to the Navy's submarine school. He had a reputation as a brave and accomplished submariner. 6 Japanese battleships were sunk by him, according to post-war sources. Eventually, he was promoted to admiral. Seawolf wasn't as fortunate. Over the course of her 14 war patrols, she sank 27 enemy ships and damaged 13 more, totaling 108,600 tons, sunk and 69,600 tons damaged. However, on September 21, 1944, under the command of Lieutenant Commander A.L. Bontier, she departed Brisbane, Australia for her 15th war patrol, stopping briefly at Manus Island to collect Army soldiers and supplies for delivery to Samar. After exchanging signals with the submarine Nar Walland on October 3rd, Seawolf vanished from view. Seawolf was most likely accidentally sunk on October 3rd near Morotai Island, by an American destroyer escort and planes searching for a Japanese submarine believed to be nearby. The 17 Army personnel and the whole 79-person crew perished along with the boat. Seawolf remains at sea on eternal patrol, as stated in the Navy's Silent Service commemoration. Time has not diminished the valor of the courageous men who served aboard her, or the more than 3,300 submariners who lost their lives throughout the conflict.